The order was issued at 2:17 a.m. Central Time on January 19th. 43 words that would fundamentally alter the relationship between federal and state power in America. By authority of the President and under provisions of the Insurrection Act, federal military assets are hereby authorized for deployment to assist with civil disturbance mitigation in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. No congressional consultation, no governor's consent, no warning to state officials who would wake up to find their sovereignty had evaporated overnight. The immediate trigger was clear enough. Protests over the ICE shooting of Renee Good had been escalating for 12 days. 4 gunshot wounds, including one to the head, had transformed a woman in her car into a symbol of federal overreach. But the deployment of federal troops wasn't really about protest control. It was about testing whether the constitutional framework that had governed America for 250 years could survive the pressures of a fragmenting republic. By sunrise, Minnesota Army National Guard units were taking positions along Interstate 35. Not to support federal operations, but to protect state sovereignty. Governor Tim Walz, facing his own federal corruption investigation, had made a calculation that resistance was preferable to capitulation. The sight of American soldiers in different uniforms facing each other across highway barriers would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Now it was just Tuesday morning in Minneapolis. The markets understood the implications before the politicians did. Silver futures opened $8 higher in Asia, hitting $103 per ounce before most Americans had finished their morning coffee. The dollar index fell 1.2% in overnight trading. But the real action was happening in places most people never see. The physical silver vaults where institutional buyers were quietly moving unprecedented amounts of metal into private storage. Because this wasn't just about Minnesota. It was about the moment when internal conflict made external currency irrelevant. When citizens of the same country stopped trusting each other's money. When the full faith and credit of the United States government became a matter of geographical interpretation. The legal framework was deliberately ambiguous. The Insurrection Act had been invoked, but the insurrection itself was a matter of perspective. Federal agents saw violent protest threatening law enforcement operations. State officials saw peaceful assembly being met with military force. The Constitution offered guidance for external wars and domestic tranquility, but not for the gray zone where they intersected. What the public statements didn't mention was the intelligence briefing that had reached the Oval Office at midnight. Not about protests or public safety, but about economic warfare. Minnesota controlled significant portions of America's copper and iron mining infrastructure. More importantly, it hosted crucial supply chain nodes for technology manufacturing that required massive silver inputs. The federal deployment wasn't about restoring order. It was about securing resources. The Minnesota National Guard's positioning was telling. Units weren't deployed to support crowd control or protect federal facilities. They were establishing checkpoints near mining operations and strategic transport hubs. The 34th Infantry Division had quietly moved to secure the Iron Range, ostensibly for critical infrastructure protection. But the protected infrastructure included silver processing facilities that served technology companies across the upper Midwest. The economic implications were cascading faster than the political responses. Firms with silver exposure in Minnesota faced impossible calculations: continue operations under federal military control or suspend activities until civilian authority was restored. Either choice carried enormous costs. Production delays would ripple through supply chains already strained by global trade tensions, but operating under martial law carried reputational and legal risks that insurance companies wouldn't cover. The Federal Reserve found itself in an unprecedented position. Monetary policy assumes a unified currency zone with consistent legal authority, but federal troops deployed against state resistance created conditions where the dollar's acceptability could vary by jurisdiction. If Minnesota businesses began rejecting federal currency in protest against federal occupation, the very foundation of American monetary union would crack. International markets were pricing in scenarios that had seemed impossible weeks earlier. Currency traders were betting on regional fragmentation of the dollar. Commodity dealers were establishing parallel pricing mechanisms for deliveries to contested territories versus federal zones. The infrastructure of global finance was adapting to the possibility that America might not be a single economic entity for much longer. China and Russia watched these developments with obvious satisfaction, but their responses revealed deeper concerns. Both countries held massive dollar reserves that could become worthless if American political unity collapsed. The Beijing Politburo held emergency sessions to discuss de-dollarization acceleration. The Kremlin authorized immediate liquidation of treasury holdings in favor of physical assets. America's adversaries were discovering that their enemy's weakness could be their own catastrophe. The silver market was experiencing unprecedented demand patterns that defied traditional analysis. Normally, institutional buying dominated price movements, but physical silver purchases by individual Americans had increased 400% since the troop deployment announcement. Coin dealers in Minneapolis reported empty inventory within hours. the U.S. Mint suspended Silver Eagle production due to supply chain disruptions that were actually security concerns about transporting precious metals into conflict zones. Technology companies faced a crisis that went beyond simple supply chain management. Silicon Valley firms had spent decades optimizing global operations around the assumption of stable domestic logistics. Now their Minnesota facilities operated under military oversight, while their California headquarters remained in civilian territory. The legal frameworks governing corporate operations, tax obligations, and regulatory compliance were fragmenting along the same lines as political authority. Military contractors found themselves in impossible ethical positions. Defense companies with significant Minnesota operations were being asked to support federal deployments against state resistance. Lockheed Martin's Minneapolis facilities produced electronic systems requiring substantial silver inputs. Now, those same systems might be used to suppress resistance in the communities where they were manufactured. The military-industrial complex was discovering that internal conflict created moral hazards that external wars never produced. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly investigating what officials described as economic sedition. Minnesota businesses that had suspended federal tax payments in protest against military occupation could face prosecution under wartime economic regulations, but enforcing those regulations required cooperation from federal courts that might not have jurisdiction if state authority was successfully asserted. The legal system was fragmenting as quickly as the political one. European intelligence services were reporting unusual activity in precious metals, markets that suggested coordinated preparation for American political collapse. Sovereign wealth funds from multiple countries were establishing silver inventories in Canadian and Mexican storage facilities. The international community was hedging against scenarios where the American dollar ceased to function as a reliable store of value. Banking relationships between Minnesota institutions and federal regulators had become openly adversarial. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation threatened to revoke deposit insurance for banks that refused to honor federal asset seizure orders. Minnesota bank regulators responded by threatening to revoke state charters for institutions that complied with federal overreach. The banking system was splitting along political lines in ways that made normal commerce impossible. Agricultural markets were experiencing the first secondary effects of political fragmentation. Minnesota's grain elevators served farming communities across multiple states, but federal control of transportation infrastructure meant that grain shipments could be subjected to military inspection and potential seizure. Farmers began demanding payment in forms other than federal currency. Silver became an acceptable alternative for transactions that couldn't rely on traditional banking. The Minnesota legislature held emergency sessions to consider legislation that would effectively nullify federal currency within state borders. The proposed Minnesota Monetary Independence Act would establish silver-backed state currency for transactions within Minnesota jurisdiction. Legal scholars debated whether such legislation was constitutional, but the practical question was whether anyone could enforce constitutional limits when military units were choosing sides. Insurance companies suspended coverage for businesses operating in disputed territories. Lloyd's of London declared Minnesota a war risk zone for commercial purposes. The economic infrastructure that enabled modern business was proving incapable of operating under conditions of divided political authority. Companies that had operated profitably for decades found themselves uninsurable and unable to access credit markets. The precious metals industry was the unlikely beneficiary of political chaos. Silver mining companies saw their valuations increase as investors calculated that internal American conflict would drive sustained demand for alternative stores of value. But the mining companies themselves faced operational challenges as federal authorities demanded priority allocation of production for national security purposes, while state authorities threatened seizure of operations that complied with federal demands. Religious and ethnic communities in Minnesota began organizing mutual aid networks that operated outside traditional financial systems. Churches started accepting silver donations for charity operations. Islamic communities established Hawala-style transfer networks that bypassed federal banking oversight. The social fabric was adapting to political fragmentation by creating alternative economic relationships that didn't depend on federal authority. Labor unions found themselves split between federal and state loyalties in ways that threatened their organizational coherence. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers had locals on both sides of the federal-state divide. Union members who worked for federal contractors faced different pressures than those employed by state agencies. Collective bargaining became impossible when the parties to negotiations owed allegiance to different governments. The Federal Aviation Administration grounded flights to Minnesota airports, citing security concerns that were actually attempts to isolate the state economically. but Minnesota's response was to authorize state aircraft to operate under state aviation regulations. The result was two air traffic control systems operating in the same airspace with fundamentally different legal authorities. Commercial aviation companies suspended service rather than navigate the regulatory chaos. International corporations with Minnesota operations were consulting with their home governments about evacuation procedures. Toyota's Minnesota assembly plant employed 15,000 workers and consumed substantial amounts of silver for automotive electronics. The Japanese government was quietly negotiating with both federal and state authorities to protect its industrial assets. The global economy was discovering that American political stability could no longer be assumed. The Federal Communications Commission ordered telecommunications companies to restrict internet and cellular service in Minnesota to prevent coordination of seditious activities. State authorities responded by threatening to seize communications infrastructure operated by companies that complied with federal orders. The result was sporadic service that made normal business operations impossible and forced communities to develop alternative communication networks. Pension funds with exposure to Minnesota assets faced impossible valuation challenges. If state and federal authorities both claimed jurisdiction over the same assets, which legal system determined ownership? The Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board suspended contributions to accounts with Minnesota exposure until legal clarity could be established. Millions of federal employees found their retirement security dependent on political outcomes they couldn't control. The silver supply chain was experiencing disruptions that went beyond simple demand increases. Transportation companies refused to move precious metals shipments through disputed territories because they couldn't determine which authority would provide legal protection for their cargo. The result was regional shortages even when global supply remained adequate. Political uncertainty was creating artificial scarcity in commodity markets. Credit rating agencies downgraded debt issued by Minnesota state and local governments, but they also placed negative watch notices on federal securities. The assumption that American government debt represented risk-free assets was proving false when the American government itself was fragmenting. International investors began demanding higher premiums for any exposure to American political risk. The Department of Defense was quietly calculating the resource requirements for sustained domestic military operations. Unlike foreign deployments, domestic operations couldn't rely on local supply chains that might be controlled by hostile authorities. Everything from food to fuel to ammunition would need to be transported from secure federal territory. The logistics of internal control were proving far more complex than external conquest. Private security companies were experiencing unprecedented demand as businesses sought protection that didn't require choosing between federal and state authority. But the private security industry was discovering that their legal authority was just as questionable as government authority when fundamental political legitimacy was disputed. Armed guards might protect property, but they couldn't resolve the underlying question of who had the right to govern. Mining companies in other states were receiving inquiries from Minnesota businesses seeking to establish direct supply relationships that bypassed federal oversight. The goal was to create silver acquisition networks that could operate under state rather than federal authority, but those networks would require transportation through multiple jurisdictions with potentially conflicting legal systems. The Federal Trade Commission suspended antitrust enforcement in Minnesota, acknowledging that normal commercial regulations couldn't function under conditions of disputed political authority. Businesses that had competed for decades were forming cooperative arrangements to navigate the regulatory chaos. Market concentration was increasing not because of corporate strategy, but because of political necessity. International law scholars were debating whether the Minnesota situation constituted an internal armed conflict that triggered humanitarian law obligations for foreign governments. If Minnesota became a recognized political entity separate from federal authority, would international treaties signed by the United States government still apply? The global legal order was confronting questions that had seemed purely theoretical. The precious metals futures markets were struggling to establish pricing for contracts that might be settled in territories with disputed legal authority. How do you deliver silver to a buyer in Minneapolis when it's unclear which government controls the transportation infrastructure? Futures contracts written for delivery in Minnesota began trading at substantial discounts to reflect political risk premiums. State universities in Minnesota faced immediate financial crises as federal funding was suspended pending resolution of the political standoff. But state appropriations couldn't replace federal research grants and student aid programs. Academic institutions that had operated for generations found themselves forced to choose between financial survival and political principle. The Minnesota situation was creating precedents that other states were studying carefully. If federal military deployment could be successfully resisted, would Texas or California or Florida face similar temptations when their interests conflicted with federal authority? The American constitutional order was designed to prevent exactly this kind of fragmentation, but constitutional protections required shared commitment to constitutional principles. As January drew toward its close, no resolution was visible. Federal authorities couldn't withdraw troops without appearing weak to domestic and international audiences. State authorities couldn't capitulate without abandoning their constitutional responsibilities to Minnesota citizens. The political logic of escalation had overcome the practical logic of compromise. Silver markets were pricing in scenarios where American political fragmentation became permanent rather than temporary. If the Minnesota precedent spread to other states, the United States might cease to exist as a unified economic entity. The dollar would fragment into regional currencies, supply chains would reorganize around political boundaries rather than economic efficiency, and silver would become the only store of value that transcended political authority. The irony was becoming clear to observers who understood both political theory and commodity markets. America's strength had always derived from political unity that enabled economic efficiency. Now, political division was forcing economic inefficiency that undermined the prosperity that had sustained political unity. The feedback loops were vicious and accelerating. The federal deployment in Minnesota had begun as an attempt to restore order. Instead, it had triggered a cascade of consequences that threatened the foundation of American political and economic organization. Silver prices reflected not just market uncertainty, but civilizational uncertainty about whether the American experiment could survive its own success. The question was no longer whether the Minnesota crisis would be resolved. The question was whether anything recognizable as the United States of America would survive the resolution.